it's your turn, Romain. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar about, as Estelle has explained, the white paper that we've released a few weeks ago now. The idea of this webinar is really to give you an idea of the content of what is in this paper. As you can imagine, given the size of it, it's impossible to go through all of its details. So I would really encourage you to read this if you found the webinar interesting. Alternatively, if you've already read this, you'll find that the content hopefully highlights the key points, and you're welcome to share your questions, which Estelle will record from the chat box. And depending on the time we've got left in the session, we will try and answer as many of them as we can. Just a brief word on ENAC Alumni before we dive into the subject itself. The Association of ENAC Alumni is non-profit, and what we're trying to do is broaden the reach of the ENAC alumni network throughout the world. There's now a large number of chapters worldwide, and we're always welcoming new and ex-students. We've done a number of thought leadership pieces over the years. This white paper is one example. We've got the larger elements that have been also created, such as the paper on future of airports, which has taken quite a significant effort to develop and also has gathered the thoughts of quite a number of participants. Now, if we focus on this white paper and its contents, what we will talk about today is a little bit of what airports should prepare for, the best practice we've identified for managing disruption in real time, and we'll cover elements on people, process, technology. The best practice that we've identified to develop resilience, which will allow you to manage disruption in real time more efficiently. And finally, throughout the document and towards the end, we will have examples of the templates and tools that are included in the paper, and which we will be spending a bit more time on during the webinar. Now, why did we write another paper about disruption management? We actually started writing this paper in 2020, which, as everybody knows, was this unprecedented times. But it's not about pandemic. It's not about long-term game changers. What we didn't want to write is another paper about reinventing aviation. And it's also not about emergency response, which is regulated and also extremely well documented. What we found is that we didn't find enough of what happens for smaller events or shorter duration events. There is extensive literature available for the impact of specific incidents or accidents, especially when they're investigated. There are a number of research-based frameworks of papers to give theoretical generic guidance, but they're not always very practical, nor are they written for an audience that is developing procedures or living in the operation. And finally, there are operating models such as ACDM to enhance operations management. But a lot of this is primarily focused on implementing this in normal operations. What we were missing, or this is where we started from, was the repository of the experience gathered from real events. Very often, people working in live environments return back to being very busy, and we forget to record what's happened, how it happened, what decisions were made, if things went well or not well in the context of a particular event. What we found, as I said just before, is the guidance that exists is generally very theoretical for the subject at hand and limited, and we found limited practical guidance. And finally, in many of the sources that we researched or the conversations we had, we agreed that there was probably not much tools and processes that can easily be adapted. So if you're trying to look today for elements of where to start, hopefully this webinar and the paper that it covers will offer you some sources. Now, the context of all this is obviously not the pandemic, as I said, but it's more reflecting on that pause in the continuous growth of the sector, increasing congestion from all angles, and the fact that in such a constrained and optimized environment, any spanner in the works will have repercussions which sometimes are not accounted for. Too often, as we said, we don't take the time to reflect on what happens, and we really wanted to leverage the experience of the people within the network to provide that guidance. So in terms of experience, the people who we've spoken to included during our research or who have committed some of their time to review the findings and help us refine this paper are working for a number of different actors of the sector, including airports, airlines, ANSPs, ground handlers, consultants. Not all of us were ENAC alumni. Some of us were industry people who we've reached out to and agreed to give a bit of their time to help with this paper. And collectively, we've got experience in managing sandstorm, floods, snow events, drone incursions and airspace closures, a little volcano in Iceland a few years back, or extensive low visibility operations. Now, the common theme around all of these is they're short-term events that usually are, well, less predictable than what you'd hope. However, some of them you can plan for, and they do not require fundamental change to your business model, but they will have an impact that can last from hours to days. So that brings us back to the risk assessment and what should the airports plan for. Now, in our view, the bigger challenge is that there's a tendency to narrow risk assessments to operational and technical risks. What we found and our collective experience suggests that beyond operational and technical risks, there's a number of events that can have a significant impact on your operation and your financials that need to be considered. Now, rather than go and give you a long list of examples, our recommendations would probably be that there's a discussion on framework. So here we've offered an example of events categorization. What you'll find in there is your events around weather, safety, infrastructure, facilities. Not all of these are directly within the perimeter of the airport, but as you can imagine, if we start thinking outside the box, there are many opportunities to start thinking about other kinds of risks. You can use prescribed frameworks such as PESTLE, which looks at also political considerations. We would recommend that you use the one that suits and is probably aligned with a risk assessment that's done for your airport community if it's already available. Now, the focus for this paper is really these low severity, high frequency events that too often we forget to plan and prepare for. So we've listed a couple here: runway closure, flight cancellations. The idea is to identify also the difficult questions, the one where time and time again, you go through the event, you manage it, and when you stop, you keep wondering why the same questions are asked over and over again. So flight cancellation is, depending on the region of the world you're in, the regulation do not apply in the same manner, and it's not as well regulated as in the US or in Europe, for example. But who pays for passenger welfare is a recurring question in other countries or other regions. How do we prioritize flights when capacity is limited is another one. So we'll try and talk about this a little bit later there. Overall, the first bullet point of the do list here is quite important, is considering the uncertainty versus unpredictability. So there are events that cannot be categorized or cannot be predicted with certainty in advance, but you know they will happen. So you may not know that you're going to have low visibility operations this year, but it's pretty certain that this will happen at some stage during the season. So how many of these kind of events usually impact your community, and what is it that if you really had the time and took a step back, you should try to start planning for? Now, the challenge that we identified these airport stakeholders and the wider communities go through during incidents are diverse. So this is the list of challenges that we've tried to address and provide answers to throughout the paper. We'll talk about how sorry, the operations are usually not prepared and ready. We'll talk about how they suffer from poor information accuracy or relevance. Obviously, there are tendencies to act when some of the decisions that need to be taken probably require to pause and take a step back to make the right decision. During disruption, we very often have a slow burn and an escalation effect. And what we mean by this is we don't necessarily start tackling the first symptoms, and only after it's escalated above a certain threshold do we really take pay attention to how we're going to solve this issue, which often means it's too late to minimize the impact as much as possible. Analysis paralysis is probably the corollary to the urgency to act, where decision makers, depending on the profile of the people in these crisis management teams, decision makers may have a tendency to wait until they've got the perfect information before they decide a course of action, which in many cases is a big challenge because the information available is of poor quality and often conflictual. So that needs to be addressed. Uncoordinated response is often a direct result of lack of preparedness and lack of coordination amongst stakeholders. No holistic thinking, and that's a reflection of people focusing on the immediate issue, and it doesn't necessarily consider the impact that this particular decision may have beyond the immediate period of time that we have or outside of the perimeter of where the disruption happens. Finally, it's very often in terms of disruption, one element of the crisis leads to another in a particular or in a different location. And the last point to raise is that there's too often no lessons learned process, which means that all the work we're doing here and gathering the evidence to offer through this white paper would be ignored if there wasn't a conscious effort to gather that. Okay, now for the real content. So how do we go about managing disruption more efficiently in real time? I won't tell you where these photos were taken from. I poached them on the internet, but I think that could probably be reflective of quite a number of incidents or accidents that have happened over the course of the years. Now, we've split this, as I said, around people, process, infrastructure, technology. So we'll start here with the people one, organizational aspects. Now, our recommendation is that you absolutely need clear accountabilities and transparent operating principles. So in other words, who does what, when, and how. Now, right size and flexible is how your crisis management team or a disruption team should be. What we mean by this is you don't want too few people, but you don't want too many either. And what you need to think about is based on the predicted duration of that incident, who's the relief crew? If your incident lasts for 12, 24, 36, 48 hours, then there's absolutely no use in putting your A team on the first shift, because what are they going to be doing on the second, third, and fourth one? So do you have the roster in place to support continuous operation? Self-sufficiency, again, a number of incidents or disruptions we've discussed were around access to airports being limited, and in such cases, it may mean that you don't necessarily have the relief available, but you also may struggle with bringing food, water, anything else in the airport. So that's also something you may want to think about how you set that up. The specialist and volunteer support available. In many instances, some of the disruption you have to manage require subject matter expertise. So whether it is capacity planning analysis, forecasting, then you need to think about how that is easily accessible in times of crisis. So does that mean you've got an on-call roster of people with this particular skill set or else? And also when disruption hits passenger-facing areas, then it's very likely that additional support may be required to engage with the front line. So do you have a volunteer support available, or do you need to think about having one? So physical collocations of the team managing the disruption is often preferred because from experience, it facilitates communication, information gathering, information sharing, and decision-making with everyone around the room. However, the next bullet point down is work from anywhere ready. And again, from direct experience, when access to either the crisis management center or the airport is limited, could be flooding on the access road or anything else, then it's likely that the people you expect to turn up to solve the crisis may not be able to turn up. So in the age of constant video conferencing, then it's probably a good idea to make sure everybody's got access to that, but also to specific tools, templates, documents that may not be physically located where the people will be providing support from. And finally, these people should think and plan on several time horizons. So we talked about this just before, but we need to anticipate the impact of the disruption or the expected status of the environment and community at several time intervals to start planning around that relief and that welfare. So on the process side, some of the guidance we would offer is to first consider, after you've done that extensive risk assessment, the potential disruption events that have got similar causes and consequences. We obviously completely validate the fact that all crises are completely different. There's always something that doesn't quite match, but more often than not, some elements will have similarities, which means that you can develop guidelines and reference for your biggest or most frequent events. Clear SOPs and checklists are very obvious, but make it clear how the disruption will be managed, who will be doing what. So here, tools such as RACI can be incredibly helpful, and they need to be discussed well in advance, ideally. But even if you start from the crisis itself and you're starting from scratch, then clearly allocating responsibilities is essential. The list of resources, points of contacts. So again, a speed dial on phone or a short list of where to get information from and who the right contacts are. The list of tools and how to use them. Again, some of the tools you may have to manage disruption may be bespoke, especially when you're trying to assess future impacts or prioritize limited spare capacity. The problem is, unless you review these tools or use and do tabletop exercise very often, you'll often be a little bit rusty in terms of their use. Now, the third bullet point here, main bullets, based on a risk assessment, you can develop individual events response plans. And we would encourage you to do this. But I think with the value of the thinking you're doing for this individual response plan would probably trigger a lot of thinking and a lot of coordination with external stakeholders for any kind of event, in which case all of it will be beneficial. Planning ahead is a process that you should develop in parallel to the response. So this goes back to the time horizon during which the disruption will happen and how long it's likely to be operating from. The difficulty that we face in many disruption is that you need people to start looking at solving the now, and you need people to start looking at solving the what's the impact of now, and how long will it take until we can resume normal operation. For all that time during which you're in between the immediate disruption management and recovery to full normal operations, there's that interim period of recovery, which is still disrupted, for use of a better word, and that requires attention. And usually it's not the same people who will have the bandwidth and the headspace to tackle that. So that's something to be looking into. And also, because of that lack of information, accuracy, and frequency, then these people need to be comfortable using wide estimates and provide an idea of what that guesstimates entail to decision makers within the organization. Developing demand management options and recommendation is the next step once you've got an idea of how long that disruption will last and what are the likely impact over time. And we'll come back to that. We've got a template for this, which has been proven in disrupted conditions. And finally, you want to monitor the progress and the disruption throughout the implementation so that you can reevaluate the approach, adjust course if need be, and close it in a proper manner. And again, I can't repeat this enough, but review and lessons learned process is essential. It happens to be the process page, so I thought repeating it won't hurt. Okay, so now to the performance monitoring aspects. The performance during disruption is tricky because you're obviously not going to reach the levels of service or quality delivery that you expect to have in normal conditions. So the first key there is to really understand what is it that you're currently facing. And we'll come back to in a second to the template on the right, and then agree what you should be targeting in terms of performance and recovery. So on the right side here, we've put a truncated version of situational reports. This goes back to that information gap that happens, but also the fact that in disrupted conditions, you tend to have representatives of several stakeholders all around the table, all providing their information. From experience, that information is often lacking in completeness, is untimely, and also it tends to be conflicting. So we would really recommend you put together a template of what information is important to you, and then you use this as a script for situational reports. So what we have here, for example, is these are the elements that are important from a particular airport's perspective in terms of airspace and runway metric, schedule integrity to understand the amounts of cancellation, stand availability for local airport, but also for the main alternates to understand what will happen when will we reach a full house. And then on the right side, there's a column with a number of areas, and the truncated part of the charts is the number of terminals, but it's essentially as many terminals as you've got and as many areas that are of interest. The idea here is really to systematically go through, when you're trying to gather information, all the areas that are listed on your checklist. So do not skip, let's pick one out of random. Do not skip landside access because there's nothing reported there last time you did that check half an hour ago, because it just means that somebody may not have noticed anything since the last time, or that the crisis is spreading to another area. So if we go back to the bullet list on the left side, so once you have that single, these inputs from situational reports, you can develop the process where people will refer to one central location as that single version of the truth. So when you're starting a new update, then you start from the previous one. When you're discussing a particular situation, then it should be recorded in a central location that everybody's got access to. So on that point, deploying a clear communication structure is essential so that we understand how information is fed up and then down throughout the different stakeholders that are addressing that disruption. The next point is around the KPIs. Now, as an airport, you may have some KPIs, but it's likely that the airline may have others, and so similar for the ground handlers. So, for example, an airport may be more interested in recovering its punctuality, or getting movements in and out of a platform, where an airline with a large transfer traffic may not really have punctuality as its main interest and may be interested in recovering as many connections as possible. Now, this can often lead to situations where you try to get aircraft in, forget to get aircraft out to connect people, and therefore congestion on stands happen. So understanding what everybody's striving for is quite interesting to, important to understand at the start of the event. You may want to develop disruption-specific indicators. or different targets for your existing indicators. So if you're aiming for 85% punctuality on a normal day, clearly that may be going out the window. But what you may want to have is specific indicators. So for example, waiting times for people in your departure lounge is something that is typically not measured outside of capacity simulation. And in disruption may give you an idea of the point at which you want to deploy welfare in the form of blankets, water, additional food, you name it. You may also want to develop some early warning indicators that avoid people starting to get agitated when we've breached the target KPI. You may want to do that in stages before. And again, on the performance monitoring aspect, if you're able to predict in the first phase of the disruption, but also at these time horizons we've developed before, the KPIs that or the performance against certain KPIs, then that will help you make better decisions. The last point, again, we're repeating ourselves, but the review process is important here because you can track progress. Hopefully, since you've recorded the situational reports, you can track progress of the decision making on a timeline that records how the various KPIs were breached. And that can be a very useful part of your review process. So one thing we've briefly mentioned earlier and is probably worthy of sharing here is particular consideration. So that's based on all the discussions we've had with the people who participated to that paper. But some of these are the key questions that have difficult answers or are difficult to discuss with stakeholders in the heat of the disruption itself. So we'll take them one by one, and I'll spend more time explaining what these are, but we're not going to answer any of these today. How will the flights be prioritized? So again, think of a particular instance where a runway may have been closed for 4 hours. You now have a queue of aircraft, all of them are being delayed. Who do you allocate the first slots to and why? How do you measure the readiness of a prioritized flight? Again, in our experience, you talk to the handler, they'll have an answer. You'll talk to the airline, they'll have another answer. So how do you get that communication flow right to know not only who's ready now, but who will be ready in 30, 60, 90 minutes, so you can start looking at your sequence here. Which airports are capable of handling diversions and how many diversions? So you'll remember on the templates that we showed earlier, there was a status update for the number of stands available at your main airport, but also alternates. Again, do you have the communication flow ready for this? As much as you, as the main airport, may be ready to do some non-standard parking, is it something that you can have a preliminary conversation with the other airports so that and increase the capacity nearby? And when you're starting to repatriate diverted flights, then again, what is that sequence? Who gets priority and why? So all of these are typically very complicated conversations to have in the heat of the moment, especially since politics gets in the way, but these are interesting challenges to try and go through. In terms of passenger and baggage considerations, so do you understand what the triggers are for airlines to cancel their flights, inbound, outbound? Do you know for flights that are not cancelled or for extended disruption, how long airlines will continue to check passengers and baggage in? Depending on the region of the world you're in, the regulation isn't necessarily as strict. And what we found in the Middle East, for example, is that there's a tendency to not check passengers in as early as you can, because the passengers may then become the responsibility of the airport rather than your own. So all of these questions may have a local component as well. What are your arrangements in terms of the cancellations? So do you know what airlines are, how your airlines operate, whether they consolidate, whether they've got rate protection agreements? That may help if you need to suggest cancellation, if you already know that some airlines within a particular group or alliance are working together and can support each other. If you've got passengers on board, what triggers disembarkation? Again, the last thing you want after people have waited for 3 hours on the airfield is that they're offloaded into an area where there's nothing waiting for them. If passengers cannot be delivered, but if bags cannot be delivered, but passengers have offloaded, where are they going to be waiting for this, and how long until they're released, and where are they going to be released? If passengers are expected to come out of the airport and come back tomorrow, do you have any particular arrangements in place in terms of accommodation, ground transportation, and the likes? Finally, I've hinted to this earlier, but who offers the welfare and covers the costs, or at least initiates that process? This seems to be an interesting one in many of the airports that we've spoken to. And do you need to have anything in place, in particular for passengers who require additional assistance? Okay, so these were specific questions that you may have or may not have, but were the ones that were raised by people who've suffered through this disruption and contributed to our reports. Obviously, more than happy to add more to the list to help people start thinking ahead. And I guess finally, on the real-time aspects is the communication. So that's going to be fairly quick because it's a lot of the things we've addressed before, but internal, external, and wider public is the audience. The content needs to be balanced between how are you managing the disruption, but also what is the impact and what's going on outside of the disruption. And you really need to think about the level of information available to each stakeholder. In many instances, try and limit this to the absolute, that wouldn't be fair. Don't limit this to the absolute minimum, but really think about what's most helpful, and are you going to hurt the process by sharing too much information with some people, because it will just get them going on something that shouldn't be concentrating on at this moment in time. You need to understand how that will be communicated and how often. And the last point here on the note there is that if you don't communicate, somebody will do that for you. So you will have social media flaring up immediately at the earliest signs of something not going well, and that will have a massive impact on the credibility of the other communication. So better communicate proactively than let social media go on a rampage. Okay, the second part is around what can you do in advance of these events to get yourself in a better position to manage disruption when it hits, or not have to manage this because you've created a system that limits its impact to start with. Again, we'll follow the same thread as we have for the real time. So first we'll look at the people aspects. So the first one there is around resilience is everyone's job. Now, in reality, it's very unlikely that the company you're in acknowledges this and realizes that. What we mean there is you may have people directly employed to develop these emergency plans or disruption management events, but very often they have requests for additional manpower, on-call roster systems, processes, materials, you name it. In reality, painting to the business a picture of the impact of the disruption, whether it's cost, reputation, you name it, is essential to get buy-in on that. And everybody who is involved in the behind-the-scenes process has a role in facilitating or making resilience building and disruption management easier. The second part is around multi-skilling employees. So that goes obviously in having colleagues able to cover for one another if possible, but also, and that's the first point here, is when things fail, do people know what they need to do, and does that need something different than their day job? So bingo cards for baggage check-in is obviously very different from using your normal DCS. How are people trained to do this? Can they do that for all the airlines that are under the responsibility? One team culture is a little bit aligned to resilience being everyone's job. You want a one team culture within your organization, across functions and layers. You want this across organizations. And here I'm thinking airport, airlines, NSPs, ground handlers, all of that. But things to consider is that The one team culture can also be illustrated by people who are not in the operation getting involved in these processes. In many instances, the qualities that make you a good team member or potentially leader in a crisis management role do not necessarily require that you're an absolute expert in airfield operations or terminal operations. So as a business, you can start developing an idea or a core roster of crisis management people that involves people in maybe leadership positions, but outside of the traditional view of compliance, operations, engineering, technical, etc. And finally, you want to support that team with the right policies. So we've talked about on-call rosters. One of the issues that I have seen before is that people don't volunteer for this because there's no compensation. It's an impact on their lifestyle. They're not going to be recognized for this. So what is important to the people within your environment that you may want to think about to facilitate uptake for this? So the volunteers group for mass events. Usually you probably wouldn't go for an on-call roster there, but what's the way to recognize people who are participating so that they feel valued and get a feeling that they're participating to something that helps? Obviously, you need to train everybody on policies, tools, the general approaches that are taken and the lessons learned from previous instances. The last thing you want is to lean on people who you don't expose sufficiently to what's been done before, and you don't give them the chance to get ready for the time where disruption hits. Regular risk assessment reviews is kind of obvious. You will build on this from your lessons learned, but even if no disruption happens, reviewing this on a regular basis is helpful. And finally, I think more details on the training bit, you can do scenario planning and tabletop exercise. As we've discussed before, maybe focus on the ones that have got similarities with your largest or most frequent risks, so that the training scenarios that people go through will resemble the potential disruption that will happen in the future, and that level of familiarity will be helpful when people jump into disruption management mode. You should obviously exercise them with all the stakeholders. As we've mentioned before, coordination between, amongst colleagues and between organization is a large challenge. And yes, by all means, if you've got an organization that's ready to develop what-if scenarios and has got the capability in terms of data integration and analytics, it's great. But in our experience, unless you're operating at a large airport with such kind of skills available on call, it's likely that this may not be available immediately. A point that you can work on in advance of a crisis to build resilience is obviously infrastructure, equipment, and systems. So we'll briefly go through this, but the objectives there are to maximize availability. So please plan your development programs, maintenance programs in a way that doesn't take out twice the amount of equipment when you could phase it in a different manner. Remove silos. So in many airports, you'll have dedicated areas, anchor agreements. Can you agree the rules of engagement where these go out of the window as soon as disruption hits, so that it gives you artificial capacity back? You should maximize flexibility. So at the bottom of this page are examples of flexible infrastructure. They can go from very fancy to very basic. So horseshoe design for baggage system is a usual one in terms of common use of terminal equipment and the likes. Balancing capacity service. So again, do you have an agreed plan for when infrastructure is reduced, and what is acceptable in terms of trade-off for service quality, whether it's congestion, queue times, process time, and all of that? That needs to be thought ahead, and it will feed the discussion on setting up the KPIs that are relevant for disruption, but also potentially your early warning indicators. And finally, consider building redundancy, whether it's for infrastructure, equipment, and system, although it's obviously the costlier option of all of the points mentioned above. Now, what process and policies can we start thinking ahead of disruption? The disruption management operating principles, as we've coined them, are completely essential, and they will avoid many conversations on the night, or at least you'll be able to refer back to previous documents and conversations in trying to justify a particular course of action. So we'll go through them because they're quite important and relevant. So, as if you are a hub airport, should you protect the hub or allow a more balanced allocation of traffic rights, slots, infrastructure equipment, you name it? I think some of the decisions that are made for large hub airports is that depending on the size of your home base carrier, the airport will never work well if the home base operation is completely disrupted. So there may be an advantage of doing this. However, you obviously run into perception of bias, whether it's perceived or actual, which may have political repercussions. So that's something for you to assess. How do you allocate available capacity when it's reduced? Do you go, for example, here, on larger seat capacity aircraft on your runway because there's a perception they'll serve more passengers? If that's the case, do you want to look at the actual loads on these? If you want to favor a quick recovery of passengers, well, they need to reach their destination, and there are many aircraft that are stranded on your platform, then maybe a faster ramp up of narrow body traffic off your runway is preferable. How do you deal with en route flights? Do you do you give them any kind of priority? Do you push them first to your alternate airports? Does that feed into your connecting targets? How long are they going to be holding for? Are there decisions that you can make early in the disruption timeline? Do you want to protect market accessibility? So that goes back again to the kind of aircraft or flights that access your platform on a less regular basis, in particular if there are no code-share or reprotection agreements. Let's say that you're faced with a situation where you need to delay flights or cancel flights, or even if you're just delaying a flight and the crews run out of hours and the next flight's not scheduled until 3 days from now, then would these flights require a particular prioritization within your choice of spare capacity allocation? What are the minimum service levels to maintain? Again, with your stakeholders, are they big no-nos about things that are not acceptable, or can you go all the way to the margins in terms of what's acceptable in passenger queue time, congestion, and the likes? And finally, in the paper, we've developed the concept of recovery time objective to help you develop a demand management approach. So rather than go through this in detail now, you probably be better off reading through the document itself. So the note at the bottom is pretty self-explanatory, but you may have to make immediate decisions during the first phases. That may not be the best one for the long run, but they may be the better one to make because they're easy to implement. So, for example, I won't refer to a particular incident that may have been part of, but in case of runway closure, you may want to reopen a runway with a limited capacity focused on aircraft such as, let's say, Code E, and limit this capacity for fewer flights on Code C and Code D. Now, that may not be the long-term prioritization you want, where you want a more balanced approach based on who the carriers are, what the typical loads are, these market accessibility and lower frequency flights, but an approach where you can immediately note what the resolution is in a language that's understood by most, if not all, of the actors is probably the easiest one to implement to start with, and then you step up from this. And finally, in order to manage these disruption approaches collectively in an efficient manner, then you need to manage expectations, roles, and responsibilities. We've spoken about this before, a clear RACI. The last point that we would encourage you to think about in advance is what will the impact of these particular disruption scenarios be outside of the area that's directly impacted, but also outside of the airport boundaries. So the obvious areas to think about here are landside access, neighboring airports, if you're thinking of diversions and the likes. So just in the next 3 minutes, what I'll do is I'll walk you through 3 of the processes that we've included in our paper, and then we'll offer the floor to questions if there are any. So here's an example of a process to develop demand management approaches that you can pretty much copy paste to any environment. So from left to right, what you're looking at doing is forecasting your demand, not just on the airport, but if you can go to a touch point level, then that will help you understand where your main challenges are and develop your approach from there. So the capacity assessment at the local airport is also essential. We'll go through this on the next slide. Once you understand your demand and capacity, then you need to look at your resource impact and have your analysis ready. The small boxes at the bottom means that from your impact assessment, you'll be able to develop a touchpoint operational plan that will explain to people how each touchpoint could be managed. And finally, a stakeholder operational plan where you can roll this up per main stakeholder who manage several touchpoints. Then you need to communicate that plan. And ideally, when you start going out of your community, then you need to communicate to people who may be flight ops communities, not based in your airports. So you're thinking HQs of the various airlines with flight inbounds, but you're also thinking of the wider community, and your whole communication process goes there. In terms of communication, you also want to recall how and why decisions are made as much as possible. That will help your review process. And the last piece of this process is to start monitoring your operation, and we'll go through this in a little bit more detail in a second. Now, I'd like to spend a bit more time on that, the supply versus demand analysis and impact. So how do you identify that the capacity that you have? I think what we would recommend is you really split this between infrastructure, equipment, resources, and processes. So what you want to look at first is how disrupted is this? So in terms of infrastructure equipment, you should know whatever information you've got available and the closures that are non-negotiable. But is there anything in your maintenance plans, for example, where you can claw back some of the equipment that was expected to be unavailable at short notice? On the resourcing, you obviously have a resourcing plan, and then you have rostering rule for all stakeholders. What is available in terms of overtime, short notice calls, etc. On the process, you're obviously dealing with an idea of what the historical and actual performance is, but you may want to reach out to your stakeholders to understand what their process capability, throughput rates, process rates is, and what it's likely to become throughout the course of that disruption. So once you've done all this, infrastructure, resource, and process, then you're able to identify what your key constraints is and have an idea of how long that's going to last for. From this, you should develop your plan for your supply, your resource, and your process and throughput assumptions. And that is essentially what gives you your airport's operational capacity that you merge with the demands to create your scenarios. And finally, just a few ideas of how to do that monitoring for the demand management approach. So again, from left to right is a kind of continuous loop where once you've got an agreed plan in place, you want to monitor for deviations in the demand. So are we likely to see more people turning up, more flights landing than originally anticipated in our plan? We want to watch out for process deviations. The process throughput rates that we were assumed, are we on track? Are we not? We assumed that we may have a particular throughput on our runway. Are we going at the right pace? Is there any challenge we want to identify there? On the capacity deviation, again, this is going back to the previous slide. Have we got more or less capacity than the plan for disruption management we have just developed? If you have any of these changes, you should essentially update the group that manages that disruption and decide whether or not these changes are significant enough and require a new a new management plan to be created. At the bottom here are the same considerations that we've offered in the white paper around additional questions to trigger your thinking around capacity and demand. But there's a lot of information that's available in the white paper, and we would encourage you to read this as it provides more information that this webinar does. So that's essentially the way we've structured the paper. Hopefully that's given you an interesting overview of the questions we've asked ourselves and how we've tried to answer them. We hope that the information that is in this webinar and the accompanying white paper will give you food for thought and hopefully a few hints of where to start if you're just at the beginning of the journey. And we'd love to hear from you if there are elements we've forgotten and that we would benefit from adding into the next version. As you know, that document is available free of use for everybody. So we would encourage collaboration in developing the next version and look forward to receiving your feedback on this. I'll hand over to Estelle in terms of managing the questions and the chat. I haven't opened this at all, so.
Yes, thank you, Romain, for the presentation. We have no question in the chat, but perhaps you can turn on your microphone if you want to ask a question directly. Don't be shy. Let's go. Don't be shy.
Hi, everyone. This is Fatin from Orlando. First, thank you for this presentation. It was very insightful. Just a couple of questions, beginning with the technology. I'm not sure if you've mentioned this because I got a few disconnections during the presentation, but what do you think about the use of technology when managing disruption, especially when you mentioned that we need to manage the process of information and make the team on one page?
So I think it really depends on the kind of airports and airport community you're part of. If you're a small airport, I would probably focus on communication supports and have the basics in place where people can have a repository of information that everybody can access, and think of the way you will record all of this for future review and analysis. Depending on what your airport is already operating with in terms of technology, you may have access to KPI dashboards, performance monitoring tools, or you may not. But the biggest challenge in disruption management is often that collaboration and coordination piece. So communication is probably where I would focus. Now, if you're a larger airport, quite complex, it's likely that you'll have systems available to run your day-to-day operation. The complexity is usually how you deal with that complexity in a disrupted environment where some of these systems may be the cause of that disruption, or the operation will run completely off balance, and therefore the information you're getting from your system is not necessarily relevant to how you'll solve the issue. The third aspect I would have is, do you need or do you want to have tools that are specifically developed to handle disruption? And I touched on this a little bit earlier, saying that what if tools are great? In fact, in one airport I worked at, we started developing them in-house to help us manage disruption, to help us prioritize slots on the runway according to particular rules. The challenge with some of these disruption management focus for tools is that you need them to be able and handle 2 time horizons. You want them to understand what the current status of the disruption is, and that's often using live information. But in order to develop mitigation plans and scenarios, you need them to be able to handle scenarios and fictitious data. So for example, if you develop a slot apportionment because your runway capacity is reduced from, let's say, 3 runways to 2 runways, so you can only depart 2/3 of your departures maximum capacity. The way you would look at developing a fair apportionment is to look at what your schedule would be for the upcoming period. But your schedule for the upcoming period is held in a system with your slot coordinator that's in the future. However, that system doesn't know how many aircraft from the present and past period are still stuck, which you probably want to merge back into your pool of aircraft hoping for a slot. So that's what I mean. And there's other examples here, but to take a simple one, the tools that you need or may want to develop to handle the complexity of disruption in large airports, you need to start thinking about what's the scenario world and how much of the actual information that I'm experiencing now should be incorporated in the thinking process to be refined, I guess. I hope that helps a little bit with the question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. And you've actually answered also the next question I had about the challenges. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question, maybe? Don't be shy. Antoine, Flore, Jay. There are a lot of participants. Turn on your microphone.
No question for me. So just thank you very much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
Ali said thank you for your presentation in the chat.
Right. Thank you. Well, thank you for attending. And if there are any thoughts, questions, or else, then you know where to find us, I guess. Unless there's anybody else who doesn't have a question, then I leave you with the way you can follow ENAC Alumni. So we've got obviously the page for the white paper. Hopefully within a few days, you'll be able to replay this webinar if you want, but you'll see we've got quite a few on there already. Some of them may trigger your interest. We've got a website, a LinkedIn page, and then Twitter, Mastodon, Facebook, on which I never go personally, but you'll find some content over there. So please feel free to reach out about this particular event or about others in the future, and we look forward to your participation in future white papers or think tanks. Thank you very much. Estelle, the last word with you.
Yes, we have Instagram. You don't have a...
I missed that one on the list. Yes, sorry.
As well. All social networks. So Ali said, il est intéressant, in French, il est intéressant d'organiser des séminaires safety et sécurité for civil aviation à l'ENAC. Thanks. Tout le monde dit, je suis d'accord, thank you. Voilà. Bon. Eh bien, il nous reste à te dire merci, Romain.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes.
Have a great day.
If you have any other question, perhaps you can write your email address.
Yes, I will share this in the chat.
Okay.
Immediately for the participants, and hopefully that turns up. Yeah, perfect. So that's the work one, and I'd love to hear from you there. And the other one is from the LinkedIn profile.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much too. Bye, and have a good night, a good day, or so on.
Yes, wherever you're joining from. Great.
Yes. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.